50 years ago, John Gardner of the Carnegie Corporation, Robert Gordon Sproul, and Clark Kerr got together and decided that it was appropriate that there be places in the United States that would deal with the issues of higher education. And they thought they had plenty of issues of higher education that needed addressing. So do we today, of course. But the result of that was a grant made by the Carnegie Corporation to the University of California and to the Berkeley campus, which resulted in the establishment of what is now the Center for Studies in Higher Education. We are very pleased that this event, which marks the 50th anniversary of the Center for Studies in Higher Education, is also sponsored by the Carnegie Corporation, which is, of course, very fitting and appropriate. And I would like to recognize and thank Dan Fallon of Carnegie, who is here with us. Tomorrow we have a full day's program on the subject of globalization and higher education. But this afternoon and this evening we look more inward towards the center. We join old friends and colleagues and we celebrate the center. There is more than will be presented here. There is material on the website. There is a list of participants of the center for these 50 years. There is a list of publications from the center for these 50 years. And there is very close to being a history of the center, which will be up there quite shortly. Today we start with a panel that recognizes past directors of the center and also alumni and longtime employees of the center for a discussion. And the subject of this discussion is somewhat generally called Higher Education Politics and Policy Making, Then and Now. It gives a considerable range of license to the speakers to pull out what they believe are important topics that we should be thinking about and discuss. And they have responded to that license with what will be a wide variety of thoughts, I know. There are 4 previous directors of the center who are with us on this panel. They are Neil Smeltzer, immediately to my left, University Professor of Sociology, Emeritus and Director of the Center from 1988 to 1992. There is Sheldon Rothblatt, who is almost at the other end, next to Mike Heyman, who is Professor Emeritus of History and was Director of the Center from 1992 to 1996. And at the far end is Mike Heyman, Professor Emeritus of Law, former Chancellor of the Berkeley campus, and Director of this center from 1999 to 2002. And 2 away from me is Carl Piester, Chancellor Emeritus of the Santa Cruz campus, former Vice President for Education Outreach of the University of California, former Dean of Engineering at Berkeley, and Director of the Center from 2002 to 2004. Rounding out the panel, we have Janet Rule, who everybody who has ever been at the center knows well. And we have Jack Schuster, Professor of Education and Public Policy at the Claremont Graduate University, former assistant to the Chancellor on the Berkeley campus, indeed probably the one who coined that title, Assistant to the Chancellor, and all that it means, and a longtime associate of the center. So I have asked each panelist to start out with a few remarks, and then we will move towards discussion among the panel to the extent that that makes sense, and then we would like questions and discussion from the audience during the time that is allotted to us. So let us start with Neil Smeltzer.
Thank you very much, Judd. I'm going to talk about constituencies of the university, which have always been with us, but which have changed their character in recent decades. The ones that have always been with us are, of course, the town gown, which goes back to the beginning, interest groups that always take an interest in what the university or college might do to further their interests, legislative and executive state officials in whose hands we often are and who also take a continued interest in universities' missions, political constituencies from left and right. I need only mention the Red Scare of the 1920s, the anti-communist scare in the 30s, the loyalty oath, pressures from the left in the 60s as the most outstanding evidences of this. Parents have always been something of a decentralized, if ill-organized constituency, but once they sense something is wrong with their children, they can become one. Alumni and other donors have been a cultivated constituency, valuable for their contributions, but often independently interested in the institution, especially its athletic fortunes. And finally, there's that diffuse constituency that reads academic novels and takes a prurient interest in the politics, foibles, intrigues, and capers of administrators and faculty. These are the traditional constituencies. In the past decades, and I will not give exact dates here, the external constituency of the university have become more numerous and more strident. The old ones have not gone away, so it's a matter of increase in numbers and complexity and difficulty. Now, I just mentioned the following relatively new constituencies. Certainly the federal government comes first, especially through its granting and environmental agencies. These have at times been coercive constituencies, enforcing affirmative action guidelines and environmental standards before permitting the expenditure of federal monies. Closely as connected with this has been what I like to call an accountability mania that has swept the country for several decades, pervading legislatures and other agencies. At one time, accountability meant that you were supposed to spend money the way you said you were going to spend it. But by now it means producing systematic evidence, often not available or producible, to assure that the institution is meeting some of its goals and generally behaving well. Industry has become a much more important constituency for the university, with the universities and research universities in particular have become more closely entwined. Closely associated with the history of admissions and affirmative action and its effects, whole new ranges of racial, ethnic, gender, and other groups monitor institutional policy closely and speak when they're inclined to do so. And there are a diversity of social movements, environmental, human subjects, animal rights, peace, and others that offer continuous and unsought moral pressure on the university. And there's always the more interested media, which takes an interest in conflicts among all these constituencies and conflicts between these constituencies and the university. Now, I can't trace all the consequences of this increased complexity, but I'll just mention a few because the time is limited. First, we've experienced the end of that blissful, possibly not existent, but still blissful world of relative ignorance and indifference to college and universities in the larger societies, in which they were given a wide berth of freedom and autonomy so long as they appeared to be behaving themselves. I use the word relative here, of course. Second, the increase in public pressure and political conflict makes the life of the president or chancellor especially precarious and pushes it toward defensiveness, crisis management, and public relations at the expense of the traditional wise statesman role that we have traditionally associated with college presidents and chancellors. It is safer to remain quiet on public issues because there's always some group that will be offended. There's been a proliferation of administrative roles and bureaucracy, third, growing from the need to answer constituencies, meet their demands, and produce evidence that they are behaving responsibly. This is one of the great principles of proliferation of administrative bureaucracy in the institution is threats from outside. To counter them, and the issue that these administrative units do is to help preserve a degree of autonomy for the institution while continuously in the business of reassuring outsiders. With respect to policymaking in general, the effect has been one of increasing timidity in this regard, increasingly trying to cope and innovate while always aware of the many toes that are out there waiting to be stepped on. So I offer no general conclusion here, except to say that life has become tougher and more precarious for institutions that are simultaneously being asked to do more, but are always tempted to do less in order to avoid adverse consequences. Thank you.
The order of introduction of the speakers will be geographic, and therefore next in line is Carl Piester.
The instruction says to keep my mouth 10 inches from the microphone, so I'm doing it. As an engineer, I have to check that out. So 8.5 by 11. One of the redeeming qualities of the center is that it's rarely been directed by anyone who's really directly interested in higher education. Their academic disciplines have always been something else: sociology, history, engineering, chemical engineering. You can make a judgment as to whether that's a plus or a minus. And I suppose the vote will take place at the end of this panel. I want to talk about something entirely different from Neil, which is not a criticism or either applauded, but simply a different dimension of then and now. And I've entitled this what I'll call the development of the tyranny of academic disciplines. And I want to talk about the evolution of academic culture, and I'm going to date it from World War II approximately. I don't then as a relative term, although it has a contextual meaning here around 50, I guess, but I'm going to stretch that a bit. So I want to look at the determinants of of academic culture evolution over that period of time, which happens to be, not surprisingly, coincident with my own academic tenure in the University of California and elsewhere. And I want to start with what I'll call kind of the grounding of the evolution, which in my view started back even in the 19th century with the Morrill Act, when Lincoln signed Senator Morrill's bill and created the land-grant institutions. That was a sea change of access to higher education. And that changed education in our colleges and ultimately universities dramatically. It had an enormous resurgence at the end of World War II with the GI Bill. So that was something that made our universities sit up. At the time, according to Ernie Boyer at least, many college presidents were very apprehensive about having veterans come back to their campuses. After all, some were married and some even had children. And there was a kind of a dragging of the feet. So that sowed the seed. But the driving forces really for the evolution of the culture, in my view, were then the Bush report, none of the two living Bushes. Then thanks to the Soviets, Sputnik, which added a huge amount of energy to cultural change, and ultimately the ARPANET, which ultimately morphed into, to use that term today, the internet. So, and I want to say something briefly about each of these evolutionary determinants that caused the mutation of academic culture. I don't know how many of you in this room were academicians at World War II time or shortly after World War II time, but at that time, the concept of the research university was still relatively dormant in my view. Certainly, as a young faculty member here, I'd never heard of the term research university. It was the University of California, and of course it still is the University of California. We use campus and university interchangeably at Berkeley. Some of you from the other campuses understand that as well as we do. So the thing that really made Berkeley and sister institutions like Berkeley something different, in my view, was the incredible impact of the Bush report, the emergence of mission agencies, the National Science Foundation, the National Institutes of Health, emergence as major players in support of graduate study and research. That was something that simply was almost a sea change in our culture. Now, that had an enormous impact on shared governance, what faculty members did, and how they spent their time. And I want to say just a few words about each of those. And this was all done very quantitatively some years ago by Ernie Boyer in his studies of the American professoriate and the companion piece of the research, I can't remember the name now. John, you must remember the other major study, but okay. The impact on shared governance, and I'm going to use Berkeley as a model for that because I lived through that experience in the cultural change. The supervision of courses and curricula at the University of California is delegated by the regents to the Academic Senate. The Academic Senate, in turn, has divisions on each campus. Each division has a set of committees called faculties of schools and colleges. Strictly, from a strictly juridical point of view, the faculties of schools and colleges control courses and curriculum. They used to control courses and curriculum. And this is one of the major things that changed. The incredible pressure from the peer review system, from the identification of disciplines and sub-disciplines, the things that are hot, the things that are cold, the things that are fundable and not fundable, the peers across the country that review your grant applications, that had an enormous impact on the exercise of academic shared governance in universities, and particularly at Berkeley. What happened was that, in my view, the committees of the Berkeley division essentially at first took over responsibility from the Berkeley division, in that the Berkeley division no longer worried about if letters and science wanted to change degree requirements, people in other disciplines, other schools and colleges let that go. In the early years here, that didn't happen. These were debated on the floor of the division. The faculty of schools and colleges, in turn, facing pressure, said this is too much work. It doesn't show up in our personnel evaluations any longer if we're attentive to what this dimension of shared governance requires of us. Let the departments do that. So the departments ultimately are the disciplinary custodians now of courses and curricula, even though departments are essentially administrative units that are not part of the formal shared governance system. A great mark of this is that on the Berkeley campus, there's only one course that's required of all students, American cultures. And years ago, there was a handful of courses that the faculty, qua faculty, said, this is what every Berkeley grad ought to have. Then the other major impact, stepping aside from shared governance, clearly is the impact on what faculty do with their time and what faculty are rewarded for doing when they spend time doing that. The system, in my view, encouraged what I'll call a kind of an academic rugged individualism. That is, I'm going to look out for my work, and colleague, you can go over and do your stuff, but don't bother me with your stuff, even though we're in the same department in the same college or school. And particularly the issue of scholarship became, in my view, unnecessarily narrowed by the fact that, well, if we're going to evaluate this piece of work, it's too much trouble to figure out if you have multiple authors, who should get credit for this and who should get credit for that. So it encouraged a kind of isolationism that, in my view, is still here, but I think is beginning to change a bit. A concomitant of that change in the faculty work was the narrowing of the meaning and the content of scholarship. Scholarship became identified almost entirely with what Ernie Boyer called the discovery of knowledge, or more generally what is called research today. And it just didn't count as a scholarly effort if you didn't discover something new. And frankly, I think the Academy has trivialized the discovery of knowledge in its hell-bound race to be the best research university in the United States. And I want to conclude by saying I think there are signs now today that this trend is beginning to change. And there's lots of reasons for that, but by beginning to change, I mean there's a reversal from rugged individualism to the concept that maybe working on research problems as a team across disciplines, across schools and colleges is a good idea, and we ought to reward people for doing that. And it's in other words, if you look at magazines like Science and see the number of multi-authored papers in Science, sometimes a half a dozen, sometimes a dozen or more people, that certainly is a team effort. If you look back even at, many years ago at physics, high energy physics, there was a lot of team effort that somehow survived. And just to conclude with this trend towards teams, in fact, sitting out there, Bob Berdahl, chancellor at the time, initiated a process of deliberately asking faculty to get together to create new academic units outside the departments, and the incentive was you'll get some FTEs if you do that. And that is a step in the right direction, and it's culminated, in my view, most recently by the, alas, British Petroleum grant, which is now sitting out there ready to be initiated on the Berkeley and Illinois campuses. So I think there's been the development of a Tyrannosaurus Rex, or a tyranny of a creature, but I see signs that maybe this tyranny is beginning to be mitigated. So that's.
Thank you, Carl. We move on to Jack Schuster.
I'm delighted to be here and greatly appreciate the invitation to be a part of this panel. My take on the topic of politics and policy then and now is to try to describe what I see as about a half dozen major shifts in politics and policy over the 50 years or so that this center has been extant. And with all the risks involved of these sweeping generalizations that this may trigger all kinds of objections to these generalizations, so be it. The first is the most obvious one, and that's the enormous increase in the scale and magnitude, particularly of the federal role with regard to higher education. It's become so greatly magnified that the federal government as a player with regard to affecting higher education in many ways is evident. Second, and perhaps more controversial, is the ideological tilt, I think it is ideological, toward a much increased reliance on market mechanisms based on the untested theory that a more efficient and more effective post-secondary enterprise would result therefrom. In the preceding conference, Erwin Feller observed that it was at the time basically of the Reagan administration and the parallel efforts of Madam Thatcher, where there was a prevailing and insistent rhetoric about market mechanisms, and that this really changed the discourse, the context within which policy, higher education policy, and so many other things were shaped. And the values of that were embedded in that discourse and embraced by policymakers to a very considerable degree, so that there results from all of this a even broadening and deepening of the fairly wild non-system of higher education that has existed almost from the beginning in the United States, with so many public systems of higher education, a highly autonomous set of almost a couple of thousand private institutions of higher education, and on and on. I don't need to dwell upon that, perhaps. I now want to touch on two major policy thrusts and one more ambiguous, perhaps conflicted consequence of all of this. So these would count then as my third, fourth, and fifth observations of sort of tidal changes in higher education policy and politics. So the third of these, the one that's a policy thrust, has to do with increasing privatization and the rise of the proprietary sector, still quite small in some respects, but growing by the minute. Again, relying on market mechanisms as a justification for feeding this parallel sector. So we have, on the one hand, something like the University of Phoenix with 250,000 students, supported by millions of taxpayer dollars through the federal student financial aid system, and Phoenix is only the largest of many such activities. There's also, as a second illustration of all of this, the whole industry that has sprung up, a multi-billion-dollar industry that assists with the financing of federal and the distribution of federal student financial aid, and that's just a direct consequence of a tilt, it seems to me, in policy that makes that possible and legitimates that. The fourth sort of bullet point in all of this has been an increase in the privileging of a utilitarian curriculum. Now, in a way that's existed, I don't know if from the beginning, but certainly since the Morrill Act, so there's nothing exactly new here, but in some respects it's a expansion of the notion of an embrace of the agricultural and mechanic arts. Now, though, it has much more to do with science and technology and equipping the United States, it is so hoped, to be able to compete more effectively in the global economy. The differences from the past are much more in degree than in kind, but nonetheless, that I think is a significant shift. Fifth and the final such policy development that I will mention that I think pervades so much of policy, both at federal and state level, is what I would call the accountability mandate. That is to say, the outgrowth of a substantial, relatively rapid shift by which a commitment to effective teaching, a good thing, has been joined at the hip with the notion of holding institutions of higher education accountable. This has a important spillover effect in tinkering with, some would even replace the system of accreditation, the system that has existed for so many years for quality assurance, with something that relies much more on measuring outcomes, but in a way that experiments a bit with the more standardization. Anyone following the spellings activities over the last months knows that there have been thrusts and efforts along those lines that have been blunted to some extent, but still the whole idea of accountability is called very much into play there. And so that is something that we should be paying a lot of attention to and understanding as a great possible shift with regard to higher education policy and politics. In conclusion, I make two observations. The first is that an unintended consequence of a bundle of policies over this last half century, especially in the last 3 decades, has been a great blurring of the distinction between public higher education and private higher education, insofar as public higher education, we know, has become increasingly dependent on private sources of revenues, and state institutions increasingly dependent on federal sources of funding rather than just the states, while at the same time the so-called somewhat autonomous and private sector of higher education has become absolutely dependent, irrevocably dependent on public sources of revenue for student financial aid, without which, if that IV were withdrawn from the arm of private higher education, there would be death close at hand. The other conclusion I make is this, and finally, and that is that American hegemony, not too strong a word, I think, to use in higher education planet-wide, that has characterized much of the 20th century, still remains pretty much intact by whatever kinds of measures one might make for the research sector, the great research university sector in any event. However, that becomes more and more at risk as other countries around the world, Asia and Europe and so on, I think model themselves more and more on some of the ways in which we have gone about higher education, and will begin to pose more of a challenge to American higher education. I leave you with that thought.
Let us proceed next to Janet Rule.
And now for a change of pace. I've been at the center for about 33 years or so, and I was asked some years ago to start working on a history of the center. John had begged me, and I had said I will as soon as I have a chance. The time didn't come up, but recently he gave me a deadline. And so we started working on the beginning of a history of the Center for Studies in Higher Education. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today, how it first started, how it grew. I'm just going to hit the high spots. I want to mention that what we have on the web now, we have the beginning of all the participants. There's still more to be added. We have the beginning of a bibliography of all the publications, still more to be added. And the history, at this point, is going to be a brief history, still to be added, and then finally a real history. And what I'm hoping today is that I can ask each one of you who has been at the center at one time or another to provide me with some more information, give me a little written memoir, give me a chance to interview you, give me some ideas of resources that I might go to besides annual reports, some of the faculty records that are left in the archives, and the books themselves. At any rate, I'll get started on this and quickly go through. As you heard, we started out as a center funded by Carnegie. And in fact, when T.R. McConnell first proposed this to create the center, he wrote a paper called Diversity in American Higher Education. This was 1956. You might write it today. You could have written it 20 years or 30 years ago or even 10. My point through all of this history is that in general areas, what happens in higher education varies somewhat. The areas of concern remain the same. It's only the details, apparently, that seem to change, at least as they're written up in annual reports. So the original mission of the center was to be interdisciplinary, to develop several longitudinal studies, several on students that carried them through 4 years of college, one of them that carried National Merit Scholars through 4 years of college. Another study was on community, or junior colleges as they were called in those days, and on the beginnings of governance, statewide coordination that Lyman Glennie was involved with. These projects, because they became longitudinal projects, carried over into the second part of the first decade. But it wasn't long before the government suddenly was feeling that it needed to develop all kinds of R&D centers across the country. Because of the longitudinal studies and other things that had gone on at the center, it was selected to become an R&D center. And the general areas are in student development access, curriculum for students, second one in governance, and statewide control. The third in all kinds of innovations that occurred over the years. And as each new project was developed, it was reflecting what was really happening, I think, in higher education at the time. So with the R&D money, and it was something like $4 million for a 5-year period, this wonderful center turned from being located in a cozy little house with several little projects going on. I, in fact, was hired as a statistical clerk to do chi-squares on what was known as a calculator, which went brum, brum, brum. It wasn't long before we had boxes and cartons of IBM cards. At one point, we didn't even analyze them here because we only had one floor in Campbell. We went down to UCLA to use their supercomputer. Well, now we all do it at our own desks. Well, that's the real reflection, I think, of what's happened in research in higher education. So we had projects that were concerned with teacher evaluations, improving teaching. We had programs that were involved with what's going on in the connection between junior colleges and senior colleges. What kinds of outcomes actually are we getting for our bucks at the universities and colleges? We were also going through a period of social unrest. You recall the 60s? And in fact, Berkeley was involved. And so we had several projects that were focused on changing student demands, on street people, on other forms of education occurring on the streets or on the sidewalks or who knows where. We had projects that also were still concerned about trustees and governance. Well, the government began to think maybe we can't continue to be so luxurious with our funding in higher education, and it began to cut back on its funding. This was a startling blow to the center, not because it couldn't go on, but because it no longer had the support of a data processing section, of a librarian. Of course, it always had a library. We also had a whole production group. Pat Cross was involved in that, in producing periodical reports, books, monographs, I don't know how many reports, in facing reality of losing the funding. We lost that kind of support staff, but in fact, the center continued with its own research, and at that time, we were still looking at new students, new programs for new students, innovations. Once again, this is a really hot topic, and that went through all of Leland Metzger's period of time, moving into Lyman Glenny's time. Lyman Glenny took over at the end of the R&D, the great R&D funding, and his interest, of course, was in in budget, and we moved into budget. We continued with a program in community colleges that Pat Cross had. We also had another one that was a program on evaluating all kinds of innovative programs that were going on across the country. In time, these projects came to an end because they were scheduled to be two-year projects, or at most 3. Around this time, once again, the campus was looking around for another director for the center. Lyman Glenny was retiring. Dale Tillery stepped up and filled in for 1 year. He had also been very much involved in the community college program. But a new idea had been proposed by some members of the faculty, some members of the administration, that it was about time for the center to make another change in what it was doing. And Martin Troe then became the director of the center. He and Sheldon determined that what was needed was not to have a huge program of research, because individual faculty members and others could be doing that themselves, and certainly our visiting scholars could too. What was really needed was an opportunity to bring together people from the campus itself. So we needed to move back onto the campus. What was needed was a chance to bring together more and more people who were interested not only in the scholarly life of the campus, but also in the policy setting for the campus. So it was more important to add other people to the community of the center. And so he suggested that we not only have faculty members at our seminars, but members of some of the analysts and some of the vice presidents, even from the office of the president. We went beyond that to Sacramento, and we even went beyond Sacramento to the world. And that it meant we were finally developing a program of visiting scholars, what we call visiting associates. And we've had about over 200 people who have come to the center to share their research, and then also to learn what was happening in California. But you know, that kind of exchange is a real exchange. That is, we learn from our visiting scholars as much as they learn from us. And that's become a terribly important part of the center. So that kind of program started with Sheldon and Martin, a series of seminars, first focused on the university itself. The university is a federal system, university then and now. We had an historical aspect, thank goodness, to Sheldon. We had programs concerned with undergraduate life. Neil Smelser was involved with that. We had a series of seminars on graduate education. Dean Cerny was involved with that. And a number of other series of seminars. We had, those were invitational seminars. The public colloquia, which we had at least twice a month and sometimes more often, involved everybody with a message to everyone to come. And so that was the program with the visiting scholars, the seminar and whatnot. That carried up until Martin stepped down. And then it was time for Neil Smelser to set life in motion at the center, which he did. He maintained the center pretty much the way it was. Finally, our good Sheldon came back to join us. Barbara Shapiro, by the way, had been involved also at one time from the history department. But anyway, Sheldon was involved, and he of course, was in on all of the earlier discussions, but he expanded the center even further by initiating some very rather large special events, not unlike this one today, which is a clear continuation of what was done before. At that time, we were not talking about globalization so much because we didn't use that word. But in fact, we were talking about, well, one of the big events was the conversazione he had, a report from the OECD on the state of California's system that OECD had created, and the examiners came to talk to us, and then we talked back to them, and then they talked back to us again. Following that, we had the rest of our wonderful directors in the final decade, and I'm going to leave that pretty much up to the last two to mention what was going on. I mean, it has grown and grown. You already know from the meeting that you've already had today what you're talking about. We've had a new movement toward the technology, and that's carried on now and continuing, but that's been going on for at least 8 years, I think. At any rate, let me close now and say if anyone has any help for me in working on this history later on, I'd appreciate it. I can't really tell you what happened in 50 years in 5 minutes, but I'd love to talk with you later.
Thank you, Janet. Sheldon?
10 inches, did you say, Carl? 10 inches. 8. Dear Janet, that was really very marvelous. It was really quite admirable. And you really are, amongst all of us here, in some sense, the real continuity. You were in both centers. You were in the earlier center, the first phase. You were in 3, even better. So you really do represent continuity, and it was a wonderful discussion. I would like to move into the interstices of that and add to it and flesh it out, because you have given a framework, and now I can move into that. And let me start by saying that I don't know if this was a fault of my early education or not, when I did an awful lot of literary criticism, but I picked up the notion that somehow being sentimental was an inferior quality. It is the privilege of getting older to believe that sentimentality is the highest of all qualities. One can be a bit sentimental, and I do detect that in Carl. Carl certainly has great love for this university and love for the past that he has known. This will be not exactly a trip down memory lane, and I should say also that I feel legitimate in being slightly sentimental in a particular sort of way, because one of my favorite novels is Lawrence Stern's A Sentimental Journey about the 18th century. If you haven't read it, it's another wacky novel of his, but it really reaches at some sort of level where you can start dreaming. And there were some dreams involved in the center, quite a lot of them. And you really should turn your booklets over and look at the inspiration and the ideas, because he really did, Martin really did, come forward with a whole set of ideas drawn out of his understanding and his learning about what such an institution might do. And he involved me at a very early time, and I felt always and to this day that I had learned at the hands of a real master. Probably one of the few people in the United States at that time was really equipped to think about the structure and organization of the university and where such a center might fit. And that is what I'd really like to address. Where in the structure of the university does such an organization fit? What sort of ambitions and ideals? Janet has very well elaborated what we understand universities to be doing, the kinds of research programs and the kinds of studies. I'd like to tread just a little bit on Neil Smelser's territory and do some historical sociology. But Neil, you're always treading on my territory and doing history. So, okay? Okay, it's a deal. It's a deal. I want to tell you something about what I learned from being involved in this kind of creative enterprise and how it made me rethink and understand sort of the nature of a contemporary university. More so than I had before. I came to the center as an historian of universities. I had been a student at Cambridge University, and I'd written a book on Cambridge University in the 19th century. But I had done it from the standpoint, essentially, of intellectual history, not with just a glimmer of a kind of historical sociology at work, a kind of glimmer of what structures and institutions are, how they're created, and how they develop. So let's go back to some of those early years, and let's talk a little bit about the internal structure of the universities. And they're very much the same worldwide. The last few days, we have been discussing the many differences between universities in the world, and there are enormous differences when you put them into very broad national and historical contexts. But there are some things that are remarkably similar. If you step into a classroom anywhere in the world, and I have, and I've taught in classrooms around the world, suddenly there are students and teachers, and there are blackboards or whiteboards or PowerPoint or whatever it is. Something clicks that says you've been there before, and you know what's happening. The universities in the world are organized on a knowledge basis, which developed historically, and in most countries, those knowledge bases are organized into departments, which are based on some kind of academic discipline, which has a history and can be spoken about. And we have very few histories of disciplines, how they split off, and how they're created. Best work has been done on the German universities, but nothing really on the American university. But one joins a history department or a sociology department or another kind of a department, having been trained in that discipline, been trained in its methods, trained to contribute to it, and living and teaching with other colleagues in a similar discipline. But a university is a much wider institution than that, and there needs to be then mechanisms for making one feel part of a wider enterprise, part of a wider identity. And we have such institutions, and other universities do too. Academic senates with their committee structures, a kind of temporary service that we all perform, and administration going in as deans and coming out as deans and returning to our departments. These are ways of meeting other people in the university and living with them and hearing how they think and how they share. Promotion committees, which mix the disciplines, sometimes put you together with other people. You hear how they discuss issues and what the assumptions might be in their field that are possibly different from your own. But I learned that there was yet another institution which performed an enormous task of trying to knit together the fragmenting elements of the university, because one of the characteristics of knowledge accumulation is that it keeps dividing. And as it keeps dividing, it keeps creating organizations to represent it. And once it does that, then it has vested interests and budgets and positions and so on. All of that I am not in any sense scoring. I think that's healthy, I think that's natural, I think that's the way it works. But once again, we come back to the issue is there something larger than your devotion to a discipline? Is there something else that defines and carries forward the notion of a university? And I found that these intermediate institutions, these units, of which we have some 40 at Berkeley, I think, that fit between departments, actually help one define and understand that larger institution of which we were a part. And I should say, and this was 1977, that Martin and I discussed this a great deal and discussed the kind of models that could be used. All sorts of things fell into your head. After all, why not sitting at dinner and talking about things that enrich our lives? There was the model of an Oxbridge College with its common rooms and combination rooms and places where people met. There was, in my fantasy, Dr. Johnson's 18th Century Literary Society, which met in London, included all the lions of the day. That was kind of fun to think about those sorts of models. But what came up, what Janet has already told you, was that a center should be created that would have room in it for anyone on the campus who wished to participate. It would be always inclusive. It would never be exclusive. Furthermore, it would define its subject in such a way that all sorts of different kinds of academics and different members of the university and people who were not directly connected to the university but indirectly connected could find a place and a home and be welcome in what was going to be and turned out to be a largely egalitarian society, completely free of any hierarchical sense. Once you entered the walls of the center, you were a citizen of the center, and we welcomed you. And so Janet mentioned this. So we invited the university, the president's office people to come and participate. They were thrilled. After all, there is this notion that somehow they don't exist, and they're doing their work. And wouldn't it be wonderful if other people in the university knew exactly what they did, and we would tell them? And then there were the other segments of the California Master Plan. There was the state university and college segment, and there were the community colleges. So crucial, the community colleges, to the maintenance of a democratic notion of access to the university. Something that can never be forgotten about is the importance of community colleges to the state of California and to American higher education. And nobody in the university ever paid much attention to them, so why shouldn't we pay attention to them? And we created a seminar, and we let them run it, and they were thrilled. And we brought in people from Sacramento, as Janet said, people who were in the state government, presumably the enemies of the university. We said, no, you're not enemies of the university, you're with us as well. And so it went. And then came the fact that actually the number of people who were in what you might call higher education studies were rather limited in number on the campus. There were people who had that interest in their disciplines, but as a kind of side interest. We tried to capture that, but we said we have to go beyond it. And so the international role of the center developed. And Martin said we will have an international component that will, in fact, flesh out whatever is missing on this particular campus. And we were lucky because in the 1970s, the 1980s, lots of the European universities were populated with terrific talent and younger talent. Now, my friends and distinguished colleagues, some of whom are present here, but came as young people in this particular kind of world. And Japan, yes, and Japan as well, yeah, Europe and Japan. And came in this world and formed part of this international community, which we helped build. Terribly proud of that, looking back on that. We helped build that. And wherever you go around the world, people remember the center and this small community that was building larger communities. We thought of the sense that we were an embryo, not only Berkeley, but in some sense the world, in spirit, because of course in practice resources are limited. Neil started out, and Jack too, talking about the changing forces in the world, a greater growing complexity, the numbers of constituencies that demand something from the university, that have a democratic right, I suppose, to demand things from the university, and which lead to the kind of fragmentation of the university that is necessary if you're going to respond to different constituencies. One part of the university responds in one way, another part of the university responds in another way. We tried to capture something enduring, something that wouldn't fragment, something that represented the spirit of the entire university. In that sense, we were, in spirit, old-fashioned, but using sort of modern means to achieve that end. I think other people who have been at the center will have to evaluate to what extent we were successful in conveying that message. We certainly tried to do it. I think we were faithful to it, insofar as we were allowed to be faithful to it, because if you're part of a larger institution, there are indeed pressures on you. But at least that was the dream. Janet knows that story. She's going to tell it. I've added to it. So it is a little bit of a trip down memory lane. I want to say that I was fortunate in the university. I was a member of a department that, when I was chairman of it, and not my responsibility, but it was ranked with Yale as the #1 history department in the United States. It was a great and it was a brilliant department with extraordinary talent. And yet, I think the most beautiful and wonderful experiences I ever had on this campus, the most memorable, the ones that fill me with a sense that there really is some hope in the world, not much, but some, was the Center for Studies in Higher Education.
Finally, Mike Heyman.
I've been taking so many notes here, this will be utterly disjointed. Also, I can't read them anymore, but I'll do my best. Judd informed us when he first contacted us that he would like us, if possible, to talk about higher education politics and policy then and now, or at least over time. And my time at Cal has certainly been a long one over time, because this is 48 years this year. And I've obviously seen lots of changes. I must say 48 years ago was 2 years after the center was started. But I didn't have much connection with the center until, as Sheldon was saying, people in the administration and otherwise were invited over for seminars. I went over and I had a wonderful time telling everybody what a wonderful job we were doing. But nevertheless, I did have a very good time. And I must say also that not until I went into campus administration did I interact much with the principal constituency of the university, i.e. the undergraduates being in the law school, except during the free speech movement. And as some of you know, I ended up playing a number of roles, kind of trying to moderate discord, which was very difficult, but I learned a heck of a lot about the politics of protest. And I've often wondered if, in an organized way, I could conclude what the impact on the campus was of the FSM days. Clearly, there were, it led to less authoritarian-seeming administrations. The ones that followed really bent over backwards to listen. It sort of enhanced the listening quality of administrations. There were obviously some curricula changes, but I don't find Berkeley a heck of a lot different now than I did 48 years ago when I came. So I think it was partly responsible for change, but not as much change as some might believe. I was in campus administration for 16 years. When I started out as chancellor, I laid down some objectives. And I'll mention them largely to talk a little bit about the politics that surrounded them. I had a real advantage as chancellor, having been vice chancellor for 6 years, so I had an inside view of what was occurring and what perhaps we had to really address. And I also was very lucky in the fact that not too late after I became chancellor, we began to get some serious funding from Sacramento, and we hadn't had much of that in the 10 years or 12 years that had preceded it. But high on that agenda was the reorganization of biology on the campus. I don't want to get in the particulars of it, but I do want to talk very briefly about the politics of it. There were some real opponents to the reorganization of biology, taking 19 departments and trying to put them into one shell. But the youth in the biological sciences prevailed because they were the ones who had come in, or many had come in, with the new view of biology as an experimental science. And they got together. And then there was some very sensible kind of leadership by Rod Park, who was the vice chancellor at the time, and we pulled that off. But I must say we had the internal disagreement there. We had some internal disagreement from the balance of the campus, which saw an awful lot of resources going one way and not otherwise. But what Marty Troe really saw, and he wrote about it at one point, was that the clincher was that the biology departments we had started to descend in the national rankings. In fact, some had dropped out of the top 10. And if, as he said, if anything gets the attention of the administration and the faculty at Berkeley is when something like that occurs. So that worked out pretty well internally. Externally, we were doing fine until the animal rights movement moved in on us. And we had some really great battles up in Sacramento. And I think there were two things I added to that whole mix because Rod was so important with respect to that accomplishment. But one was the Sacramento politics and making the arguments constantly to state legislatures about the necessity of doing their share in the funding of this. And the other was beginning to organize fundraising on this campus because it was clear that we were not going to get enough money from the legislature to accomplish what we wished to. And that led to a whole reorganization of fundraising on the campus. And that was one of the biggest political educations I ever got, because there were a few departments, engineering as a college, and a few departments that were very skillful in raising money. The College of Letters and Science was terrible. They didn't raise a nickel to speak of. The heart of the university was powerless to go outside to raise private funds. But it was clear we had to bring everybody together to some extent if we were going to do anything sensible in raising money. There were quite difficulties my difficulties in bringing that about were enhanced by the obduracy of some of those successful fundraising colleges and departments. But we eventually overcame that, and as a matter of fact, that led, I think that was the beginning of doing a heck of a lot better elsewhere. But the internal politics of that were considerable. And the external politics with constituencies was really interesting, because when we really started to raise serious money from private individuals, it had to be from alumni, and the alumni were people whose children or grandchildren were getting turned down for admission to Cal, and prominently in people's mind was that our attempts to bring about a greater integration on the campus, especially of African Americans and Latinos, was the obvious block to those people I've just mentioned. But somehow we managed that. I'm not quite sure how we did. I think we really look back to the history of the university with respect to being a place that was a great bridge for people who were underprivileged to make it in California, and I think that helped enormously in bringing about some kind of a commitment by those who had money. But the last objective was clearly the most important in retrospectively, and that was maintaining Berkeley's prominence. And by prominence, I really mean ratings, and I mean all of those outside judgments that are made of the campus. I often think that in modern history at this campus, the thing that it makes a chancellor quiver is the prospect that we might drop out of those ratings. I see Bob Berdahl nodding his head, and that brought it back a lot of togetherness on the campus, not losing that kind of prominence. And that leads me to introduce, but certainly not to explore in any depth, a topic I told my colleagues I would raise. And that is, what's the future? Can public research universities continue to compete vigorously with their private counterparts, given the huge increases in endowments at those institutions with which, for instance, Berkeley really competes, and the reduction that's occurred over the last 10 years or more in state funding for the university? And I think that that's a real threat with respect to this kind of a university. Steve Brint, who's in the audience here and has been an associate with the center and is a professor of sociology at Riverside, wrote a very interesting paper that's in the CSHE series on the general subject. And he concluded that public research universities, taken as a whole, can continue to fulfill highly useful social purposes measured by human capital development, in other words, students and their development, and the quantity of research publications that come out of public research universities. And both of those conclusions follow from what he had as the business model for public research universities, which was a high volume of students at a low cost, which produces significant faculty numbers and concomitantly significant research volume. And I don't disagree with that general conclusion. But my issue involves a subset of the private and public research institutions, the ones with the highest intellectual ratings, which rely on quality of faculty and quality of graduate students primarily. And this combination of talent produces eminent research, and I think has a very real spillover effect on undergraduates. And I put it this way, that undergraduates, more often than many believe, come into contact with first-rate intellectuals at Berkeley, both of the faculty, and maybe not as often as occurs in a Harvard or a Yale, but certainly a number of such experiences. And it's that intellectual core which really create institutional standards and impose significant pressures for excellence throughout the university. Berkeley is not an easy place to come as an undergraduate, as many of you know, and that's because most of the courses are pretty tough. And they're pretty tough because the faculty is informed by itself and certainly by its best with regard to what goes, what is an acceptable standard. And to go on with that, the existence of such universities, and I'm using ours obviously as an example, and especially the notion of lower cost public ones, sponsors competitions for admission, which has to affect at least some aspects of K through 12 education, certainly curricula offerings. and importantly, the motivation of many students of ability to excel in order to be admitted. And they continue, and Berkeley is amongst these, to provide significant opportunities for upward mobility. So I think that these are very important, and I'm worried about places like Berkeley, given the financial situation that I described previously. Now, what would be the outcome if our resources are diminished in relation to those places whose resources have been enhanced? Well, basically, over time, we'll fail to hire and retain the best faculty. There will be, and perhaps there has been already, an attrition, at least in some places in this university, of graduate student excellence in particular fields. There might be a dichotomy between science and engineering on the one part and the rest of the university on the other, when you think about sources of funding and also the ability to consult and thus to enhance faculty salary. But I think that would be a tragedy with regard to a place like this if we put all our marbles or all our marbles go into those fields. Is there a solution? Well, I don't know, but because I'm not very optimistic about state funding increases over time, given the competition for public monies that are obvious, and the attitude of the electorate, by and large, against any new tax revenues, other than bond revenues, because nobody really thinks about that in terms of increasing the annual budget in order to pay them off. But they're not immediate taxes that come out of people's pockets that year. How far can we raise tuition? It obviously has raised, and in the professional schools, or at least in particular professional schools like Bolt, it has really gone up. Our in-state students this year are paying $25,000 in fees or in tuition, and our dean is pushing to have that go up, understandably, because he's trying to compete with the best of the law schools throughout the country, just in a microcosm what I'm speaking about with respect to the whole. It's been suggested, and I leave this for your cogitation, that perhaps one way to try to proceed is to share the bounty in terms of private fundraising. Clearly, we've done much better than we had ever done in the past, and that seems to be going up constantly. But you know, as we all know, this is a university of separate parts, as well as a place of togetherness. And it's the separate parts that are raising the money specifically. And it's the places that are very important to the health of this university that have much more difficulty. Is there some way we could do a tax across the board on all fundraising so we could redistribute some? Paul Gray speaks about this, and I think it's a wonderful idea. I just wonder if politically it's a feasible idea. But I think that we are going to have to come up with some solutions to a situation that does not bode well for us.
Thank you, Mike. One thing that was really not addressed very explicitly was the move of the last few decades towards much more industrial involvement and industrial support of the university. Would anybody like to remark on trends they see associated with that, whether this is good, whether we exercise enough controls on it, whether we don't?
Well, John, the most vulnerable institutions are those that that make the most arrangements with the business and industry, and that, of course, usually means the medical schools. I always used to wake up every morning and thank the Lord that Berkeley did not have a medical school for this reason. But it's affected very much and it's also differential within any given general campus. Of course, the science and engineering are the most closest attention here, because those are the areas in which the technical expertise tends to pay off and in which arrangements of joint research are there. I think the public institutions probably have a leg up initially on this because they are public and are being watched more carefully from outside, and for that reason would be somewhat quicker to curb looming excesses with respect to industry influence over things we do not want to be influenced.
Carl?
You know, as Neil mentioned, this is not a new problem for engineering. We've had industrial sponsorship of research for many, many decades. And it really took off dramatically in the 1980s when we were concerned about losing our ability to manufacture in this country to Asian countries. From my own experience, both as a faculty, if I can speak personally, as a faculty member and then later as a dean, the first outside research sponsorship I ever had was from a corporation. I did not find the skeletons in the closet or the evil spirits in the closet that many people see in this area. That certainly I don't mean to say that it's not possible, but if you have a faculty that I think we have at Berkeley, the intellectual quality, the integrity of the faculty, these are decisions that by and large depend on the integrity of individuals, and in certain areas there are oversight committees that reinforce the judgment of individuals. And I think if it's done properly, there's no reason why we should be any more concerned about industrial sponsorship of research than government sponsorship of research. To be sure, the majority of research typically in physical science and engineering comes from the federal government. And if you think they don't have an agenda, then you haven't read the paper. Because I think the federal government has, indeed, in many cases, more of an agenda than corporate America.
Could I add to that, Carl?
Please do.
I think the history of universities would bear you out. The real threats to the academic life, and however you want to define that life, and academic ability to make decisions about what are appropriate research topics or what should be studied and taught, have always come from government and not from industry. There's something else. That doesn't mean there haven't been occasions. There's something else, too, and that is the modern world is one in which the universities have created. The people running these industries are people we educated, we trained. Is there a little piece of us embedded in them somewhere, a chip maybe, that we stuck in there during the years they were with us?
It follows a little bit on what I was talking about before. I really agree with Carl about the propriety with which most universities deal with sponsorships, including industrial sponsorships. What I'm very worried about is whether, given the enormous amounts of money that are going into those kinds of activities on the campus, whether we really can maintain an education which is a liberal arts education for undergraduates. That really does worry me, because when I gave you that little example, I didn't give you this example, I'll just give you an example at the moment. One thing apparently that's, or at least I'm told, has been going on, and I could well understand it, is that when big offers come from outside now for prominent people on this faculty, we really try to match those offers. And they are big offers. And how do you match them when you don't have a big pool of money to match them out of? What you've got to do is you've got to rob the salary savings, which really essentially means that you're going to hire less people than on paper it says that you have on the faculty. and you're going to use those funds in order to do a put and take. I'm sure we're doing some of this. I wonder if we're doing this in the humanities and the social sciences as well as in the sciences. It's those kinds of things that are not evil at all in their contemplation, but over time, if there are tendencies one way or the other, we might really start to get this place out of balance, and that worries me.
I think, Mike, that there is something of that there, but there are mechanisms, opportunity costs, for example. Don't we charge? No, there's an overhead charge. That is redistributed by chancellors, isn't it? No, not very much?
There's a hell of an argument every time you get them as to whether they go back to the source or whether they get redistributed.
I once sat on when I was in the executive of the Academic Senate, we asked the chancellor of the day to tell us exactly where the opportunity funds were going. And we had a lot of trouble with that one. But we did find that there was a small sum that went to the football team for coaching. That is, coaching those players who weren't academically up to par. Just a small amount.